Ryan's office revenge.
I was checking the torque specs on my digital caliper when Eddie Rodriguez, the maintenance guy who'd been here maybe 6 months and still jumped every time a pneumatic line hissed, appeared next to my workstation like he'd been practicing the approach all morning. "Mr. Webb," he said, voice barely above the ambient hum of the cooling system, "they moved your blueprints into the main conference room. I don't think you should go in there just yet." He didn't elaborate. The way his eyes darted toward the administrative wing told me everything I needed to know. I set down my caliper and waited near the parts inventory, silent, listening to the familiar rhythm of the plant's heartbeat. The overhead fluorescence buzzed with that specific frequency that meant the voltage regulator was running a fraction high, but steady enough. 12 minutes later, the conference room doors opened. "My name is Marcus Webb. I'm 58, been doing manufacturing systems consulting for 27 years, and I've seen enough shortcuts to know when someone's about to get people hurt." There he was, Bradley Foster, fresh MBA and nephew to plant manager Richard Foster, walking into that conference room like he owned every bolt and bearing in the facility. Clean pressed shirt, polished shoes that had never touched a shop floor, and that particular brand of confidence that comes from never having to explain why a safety interlock failed. He tapped the projector remote. First slide appeared on the screen. My slide, my exact automation sequence blueprint. Even my certification watermark was still visible in the bottom corner, faded, but there like a ghost of 27 years of keeping people alive. Pause here, because what's coming next is bigger than one stolen presentation. If you've ever had some hotshot try to mess with safety protocols you spent decades perfecting, if you've watched some kid with a degree try to improve what you built with blood and experience, take a second to understand why this matters. It's not about pride. It's about the fact that when you cut corners on safety systems, people don't just lose money, they lose fingers, or worse. I'd learned that lesson the hard way 15 years ago at a plant in Ohio. Good worker named Danny Morrison, 28 years old, 2 kids at home. Someone had bypassed a proximity sensor on the stamping press to speed up production. Just temporary, they said. Just until the new parts come in. Danny reached in to clear a jam during what should have been a locked-out cycle. The press came down. I was the one who had to walk into that break room and explain to his shift partner why Danny wasn't coming back from lunch. That's when I stopped being just another consultant and started building systems that don't trust people to do the right thing. Systems that assume someone will always try to cut corners and make sure those corners can't be cut without triggering every alarm in the building. Bradley started talking. Same cadence I used in regulatory briefings. Same technical progression I'd developed through 15 plant installations across 8 states. But it wasn't just copying, it was dangerous. My fail-safe cascade protocols weren't public domain. They weren't in the plant manual. The only way he had access to those blueprints was through the secure partition on the engineering server, which required my personal certification key. That explained the 3:42 a.m. system access alert I'd flagged that morning. I'd spent the last 15 years developing a comprehensive plant safety automation system. Interlock sequences, emergency shutdown protocols, redundant sensor networks, all housed behind encrypted access tied not to the company but to my firm, Webb Industrial Solutions. And this entitled nephew was now parading it around like he'd sketched it out over weekend coffee and good intentions. The system I'd built here wasn't just another automation project, it was personal. After Danny Morrison, after watching his wife at the funeral, after seeing his kids ask why Daddy wasn't coming home, I swore I'd never let another preventable accident happen on my watch. Every sensor placement, every interlock sequence, every fail-safe protocol was designed with one question. What if someone tries to bypass this to save 30 seconds? I didn't storm in. I didn't make a scene. I just opened my tablet, accessed the system diagnostics panel, and pulled up the access logs. Every entry, every file touched, every protocol viewed from that unauthorized login. At 3:42 a.m., someone had used my elevated credentials from inside the facility. Not remotely, not through VPN, physically here at the plant. The badge logs would complete the picture, but I already knew what I'd find. This wasn't just theft anymore. This was someone playing with fire in a room full of gasoline. Meanwhile, back in the conference room, someone laughed at one of his explanations. One of mine actually pulled straight from a safety briefing I'd given to OSHA inspectors 8 months ago about why you never ever bypass proximity sensors on conveyor systems. I wondered when this had stopped being professional theft and started becoming a safety violation that could kill someone. He was selling cost-cutting modifications to a room full of people who'd never had to explain to a worker's family why their husband wasn't coming home. But someone was about to ask the right questions, because when you operate under federal safety certifications like I do, access logs don't just sit quietly in digital storage. They ping compliance systems, they trigger audit protocols, they activate clauses most managers never bother reading, especially Clause 47B about unauthorized access to safety-critical systems. So I waited, calm, methodical, tablet in one hand, caliper in the other, watching the countdown, watching the storm build in the electrical readings of every system he was about to compromise. I almost smiled when he credited my work. Marcus Webb's automation framework provides the foundation for these efficiency improvements. Bradley announced, like he'd gotten my blessing over handshakes and professional courtesy that morning. Marcus Webb's framework, like I was some theoretical predecessor instead of the guy sitting 200 feet away, checking equipment tolerances and resisting the urge to shut down his presentation through the master control panel I'd designed specifically to prevent this kind of stupidity. He didn't acknowledge the certification stamps embedded in every schematic, didn't mention the liability insurance that was tied directly to my personal license. Just moved through my blueprints like he was auditioning for a promotion that had already been wrapped up in family connections and corporate nepotism. His voice hesitated when he got to the sensor redundancy section because that wasn't his area. None of it was. The automation system wasn't just about flowcharts and efficiency metrics. It was interlocked timing sequences, fail-safe protocols, and emergency shutdown cascades that don't make sense to people who think safety is just another line item to optimize. One of the production supervisors, a guy who'd been here since before I installed the first proximity sensor, cleared his throat. Tom Garrett, 20-year veteran who'd seen his share of close calls. How exactly do these new efficiency protocols handle sensor failure during peak production runs? He asked. Bradley blinked, then said something about adaptive threshold management, which isn't a real thing, not in manufacturing safety, not in any system I've ever designed to keep people from getting crushed by machinery. But nobody challenged him. Nobody looked concerned. Because when you're young, educated, and related to management, people nod through your dangerous nonsense like it's innovative thinking instead of a blueprint for workplace fatalities. I sat there in the parts area, invisible, while they let him dance around 27 years of safety engineering, like it was inspiration he'd downloaded from LinkedIn. He had my blueprints perfectly copied. System diagrams, wiring schematics, even my signature equipment specification that reads, "Pause here, verify all interlocks, then energize primary systems." I developed that safety rhythm through 3 near-miss incidents and 1 accident that still wakes me up some nights. And he took it, wore it like a credential, and strutted into that room without understanding that every shortcut he was proposing could put someone in the hospital. The worst part wasn't the theft itself. It was watching him skip over the emergency shutdown sequence entirely. Of course he did. That section required hands-on experience with equipment lockout procedures, something you don't learn in business school. The real safety protocols were encrypted behind links that only opened with my active certification session anyway. But here's what Bradley didn't understand, and what his uncle Richard Foster should have known before letting this disaster unfold. He hadn't just stolen a presentation. He'd accessed federally regulated safety documentation without authorization, and every minute he stayed logged into my certification system, every protocol he displayed while impersonating my credentials was being tracked, mirrored, and stored on a separate audit server because I designed it that way. When your automation system controls equipment that can kill someone in under 2 seconds, you don't trust people to follow rules. You build an automatic compliance monitoring, you code in regulatory alarms, and you keep your real safety protocols locked behind certification keys that don't just disappear when some MBA decides to save the company money. The system I'd built had learned from every mistake I'd witnessed over nearly 3 decades. The stamping press incident that took Danny Morrison wasn't the first accident I'd seen, just the one that changed everything. Before that, there was the conveyor belt in Michigan that caught a worker's sleeve because someone had disabled the emergency stop. The overhead crane in Texas that dropped a load because the operator bypassed the weight sensor warnings. Each incident taught me something new about how people find ways around safety systems, and I built those lessons into everything I designed afterward. That's why my automation framework wasn't just about efficiency or productivity. It was about assuming the worst-case scenario and building protection against human nature itself. Every sensor had backup sensors. Every interlock had redundant interlocks. Every emergency stop had multiple triggers that couldn't be disabled simultaneously without triggering a plant-wide lockdown. Bradley had my structure but not my access. And that distinction was about to matter because what he didn't realize as he clicked through the most dangerous presentation of his short career was that federal safety inspectors had already been automatically notified the moment he accessed controlled safety documentation from an unverified device. The system worked exactly as I designed it. At 3:42 a.m. when Bradley used my stolen credentials, the first alert went to my tablet. At 3:43 a.m., a secondary alert went to the Federal Compliance Database. At 3:44 a.m., an encrypted report was automatically generated and queued for OSHA review. By 4 a.m., federal inspectors were already scheduling an unannounced site visit. I didn't make those calls. I didn't file those reports. I didn't trigger that investigation. The system did it all automatically because that's what happens when you try to circumvent safety protocols that are designed to protect 150 workers from industrial equipment that doesn't care about quarterly earnings or family connections. They came in quiet, 2 of them. OSHA inspectors don't announce themselves. They just materialize in hard hats and clipboards, like the industrial equivalent of antibodies responding to an infection. Bradley paused mid-sentence, remote frozen in his hand. The projector light caught sweat starting to form on his forehead. He wasn't smiling anymore. "Excuse the interruption," said the taller Inspector Johnson. I think his name was. I'd worked with him on 3 previous plant audits, always thorough, always focused on keeping workers alive instead of keeping shareholders happy. "We just have a question before this continues." He didn't sit down, didn't offer small talk. Just held up a printed alert with the federal seal visible, even from my position near the inventory racks. "Who accessed Marcus Webb's certified safety protocols this morning?" Bradley blinked. You could almost hear the excuses spinning up behind his eyes. "I was given authorization," he said, voice cracking slightly, "for operational continuity purposes. My uncle said I had clearance to review efficiency opportunities." The second inspector, Martinez, didn't blink. "Your uncle said," she repeated slowly, like the words tasted like liability. She consulted her tablet. According to federal safety compliance logs, that access occurred at 3:42 a.m. from an unregistered device. It accessed controlled automation blueprints tagged under Personal Certification Authority. Are you aware what that means? The silence that followed was the kind that makes even ventilation systems seem too loud. I checked my caliper readings again, not because I needed to, because I didn't want to watch Bradley realize how deep he'd stepped into federal regulatory territory. Martinez continued without warmth in her voice. "Those protocols aren't just company property. They're personally certified safety systems under CFR Title 29, Section 1910. Access without proper authorization constitutes a federal safety violation. Marcus Webb isn't an employee. He's a licensed safety consultant under Webb Industrial Solutions." Someone in the room coughed. A chair squeaked. One of the production assistants reached for their phone like they might need to call their union rep. I didn't walk into that conference room. I just opened my tablet and sent the file I'd been preparing since 3:43 a.m. Subject line: Unauthorized Safety System Access. Federal Compliance Violation. The document was clean and thorough. Time-stamped access logs, certification breach alerts, IP traces, and device fingerprints proving Bradley had attempted to access the restricted compliance database twice and failed both times. At the bottom of the report, a section of my federal safety certification highlighted the relevant regulation. Unauthorized access to certified safety protocols constitutes grounds for immediate regulatory intervention, including impersonation of certified personnel, credential sharing, and presentation of controlled safety systems under alternate authority. Johnson glanced at his tablet, presumably reading my attachment, then looked up at the room with the expression of someone who'd just discovered asbestos in the ceiling tiles. "Nobody in this facility," he said carefully, "is authorized to modify these safety protocols without Marcus Webb's written certification transfer. That includes all derivatives, efficiency modifications, and operational adjustments." Bradley's voice cracked. "But I was told my uncle approved." "Your uncle," Martinez interrupted, "doesn't have the authority to override federal safety certifications. Only the primary license holder can authorize changes to life-critical automation systems." The plant manager, Richard Foster, looked like someone had just explained that his nephew had been juggling live grenades for the past 45 minutes. He didn't defend Bradley. He didn't even speak. He stared at the screen, at my blueprints, like he suddenly understood how catastrophically expensive this mistake was about to become. I stood up from my workstation and walked toward the exit. I didn't need to watch the rest. My certification system had already spoken for me. By lunch, the entire plant felt different, like someone had adjusted the pressure relief valves and nobody quite trusted the readings anymore. Production lines were still running. Shifts were still changing, but nobody was actually focused on their work. They were checking phones, whispering near the time clocks, watching the management offices like they expected federal agents to start interviewing people. At 12:17 p.m., access to the automation control systems froze. One by one, the safety interfaces began displaying the same message: certification authority suspended. Contact primary license holder. The production supervisors tried to override the lockout and got system errors tagged with my certification number. Tom Garrett called me from the floor. Marcus, what the hell is happening? Every interlock on line 3 is showing red, but the equipment's running fine. System's running diagnostics, I told him. Nobody touches anything until federal compliance review is complete. How long's that take? Depends on how cooperative management wants to be. By 2:30 p.m., the main production Slack channel went silent. No updates, no schedule changes, just a growing collection of confused emoji reactions. Then, quietly, a new channel appeared. Emergency production protocols, created by one of Bradley's efficiency team. No invite sent to me, obviously. This was damage control, a desperate attempt to restart production without touching any system that required my certification. Too late. The automation framework wasn't just blueprints and wiring diagrams. It was integrated into every conveyor interlock, every sensor array, and every emergency shutdown sequence in the facility. They hadn't just stolen a presentation. They'd tried to bypass the central nervous system of a plant designed to keep 150 people from getting killed by heavy machinery. I didn't intervene. I just monitored my systems, laptop, tablet, even my certification-linked access credentials automatically revoked from all plant networks like a protocol exhaling. That wasn't punitive, it was pre-programmed. Federal safety revocation triggers when unauthorized access occurs, and it suspends all integration until compliance review is complete. At exactly 4:15 p.m., the plant manager's executive dashboard flashed red. Safety certification suspended, consult primary authority. I heard from Eddie Rodriguez later that Richard Foster stood there staring at the screen for 10 minutes, muttering about system glitches until his assistant quietly placed a copy of my federal safety certification on his desk. I imagine that moment felt like watching a house of cards collapse and realizing the foundation you'd ignored was the only thing holding everything together. The afternoon shift started getting nervous around 5 p.m. when routine maintenance requests started getting kicked back with the same error message. Can't lubricate bearings without safety lockout override. Can't adjust belt tension without sensor verification. Can't even replace burned out warning lights without my certification system confirming the work order. Meanwhile, Bradley had vanished from all company communications. No emails, no Slack posts, just radio silence like he was hoping the building would reset itself and everyone would forget the past 48 hours. They wouldn't. Federal safety systems have long memories, and so do the people who depend on them to go home alive every night. By end of shift, the plant's production schedule wasn't just delayed, it was paralyzed, and I hadn't even filed the formal OSHA complaint yet. They called the emergency meeting for 7 a.m. sharp. No coffee service, no conference room pleasantries, just 8 people in a windowless room trying to figure out how to restart production after someone had essentially cut the brake lines on every piece of equipment in the facility. I didn't attend, obviously. My certification didn't require me to help them fix what they'd broken. But I had monitoring access to every safety system in the plant, and the compliance audit logs told me exactly when the walls started closing in. The CEO opened with the question nobody was prepared to answer. How do we restart production? The OSHA inspector didn't hesitate. You don't. Not until the primary certification holder reinstates system authority or provides written transfer protocols. Johnson laid out the reality like he was reading a safety manual. Those automation systems are personally certified under federal regulation. Internal override isn't legally permitted. The unauthorized access triggered automatic compliance suspension of all dependent safety systems. Richard Foster shifted in his chair, like someone had just told him his insurance was canceled during a hurricane. But he's just a consultant. You're saying we don't control our own safety systems? Martinez turned a page in her folder. He's not just anything. He's the federal license authority for every automated safety protocol in this facility. Those systems can't be duplicated. modified or reassigned without written authorization from Marcus Webb or a federally appointed replacement. Then she slid the documentation across the table. It wasn't a threat, it was a receipt showing exactly how much trouble they were in. The CEO leaned forward. "So we're liable for federal safety violations?" "Yes," Martinez nodded. "Unauthorized access to certified safety systems, especially under credential impersonation, constitutes a federal workplace safety violation. The violation originated from a device associated with Mr. Foster's nephew without proper authorization or written consent." I was told the CEO exhaled like he'd just been handed a bill for rebuilding the entire plant from scratch. Nobody mentioned Bradley's name after that. They didn't have to. He hadn't shown up for work, hadn't answered emails, and probably wouldn't be seen around the facility again. Then Johnson presented the backup evidence. A screenshot of my certification watermark embedded in the corner of Bradley's presentation slides. Not decorative, legally binding. Modification requires active federal certification, non-transferable. That single line turned the room into a freezer. And if that wasn't enough, he followed with an email from Webb Industrial Solutions outlining the federal safety certification agreement, the non-delegation clause, and a compliance summary showing that all automation protocols had to be routed through my personal certification authority only. In other words, they had no production capability. They had no safety clearance to operate equipment. They had no legal authority to restart a single conveyor belt. The only path forward ran through me, but they'd burned that bridge when they let Bradley use my name like a hall pass and pretended it wasn't theft. The board liaison finally spoke, barely above a whisper. "Can we salvage production?" Johnson didn't answer immediately because the answer wasn't his to give. It was mine. By Wednesday, the plant was a monument to regulatory oversight. Every system attempt failed with the same message: federal safety certification required. Teams sat at control stations like passengers waiting for a train that had already derailed. Maintenance couldn't perform equipment checks. Supervisors couldn't adjust line speeds, and even the loading dock couldn't operate the overhead cranes. The automation system had been the spine of everything, and now it was a locked vault with the only key sitting in my home office. Someone tried importing backup safety protocols from another facility. The system flagged it in 8 seconds and auto-generated a compliance violation report. Another supervisor attempted to manually override a conveyor interlock. Same result. My certification system recognized the fingerprint and rejected the override as unauthorized. By noon, a notice appeared on the company bulletin board. Administrative leave, Bradley Foster. Federal compliance review pending. No explanation, no corporate speak about pursuing other opportunities, just a bureaucratic, vanishing act. He was gone, and the silence that followed said more than any press release. His uncle, plant manager Richard Foster, waited until that evening to email me. Long message, apologetic tone, tried to thread the needle between we didn't know and he went too far without permission. Said he respected my work, always had, hoped we could restore the working relationship. He didn't get a reply because it wasn't my decision to make. That authority belonged to federal regulators now, and they responded on OSHA letterhead with one sentence: all certification authority remains under existing federal license. Reinstatement requires compliance review and authorization transfer. They attached an invoice. $5,000 to $8,000 payable within 30 days. Line items included unauthorized access penalties, federal compliance violation fees, production disruption costs, and safety system audit requirements. No appeals process, no corporate discounts. The line between consultant and critical infrastructure had finally been drawn in permanent ink. The article appeared Friday in Manufacturing Safety Weekly. No drama, no accusations, just 7 words that made every plant manager in the region check their consultant agreements. Facility shut down follows safety certification violation. They never used my name, of course. Professional courtesy and legal precision. But the quote they pulled from OSHA said everything. When you build around certified safety systems, respect the certification before you try to modify them without authority. 2 weeks later, I got a call from the National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health. They wanted me to present at their annual conference about automated compliance monitoring in manufacturing environments. 6 months after that, I was consulting with 3 other agencies on updating federal safety certification standards. The plant eventually restarted production under a new safety consultant, someone I'd trained myself. It took them 8 weeks to get fully operational again, and every piece of equipment now carried a placard. Safety protocols may not be modified without federal certification authority. As for Bradley Foster, I heard he left manufacturing entirely. Last I knew, he was selling insurance in Phoenix, probably safer that way for everyone involved. I'm still checking tolerances with the same digital caliper, still building systems that don't trust people to do the right thing. The difference now is that when I walk through a plant, supervisors know my name before I introduce myself. Not because I'm famous, because the systems I build have become the standard for keeping people like Danny Morrison's kids from losing their fathers to preventable accidents. That's worth more than any revenge. Sometimes the best way to win isn't to fight back. It's to build something so solid that when people try to tear it down, they only end up proving how much they need you.